So, we'll get started. I'm going to be talking about psilocybin for substance use disorders, reviewing prior trials, getting into future ones as well, and we will skip through was a co-investigator for a nonprofit drug company. I have no other disclosures. So let me just skip ahead to the overview. So first off, I'll give a very, very, very ultra-rapid background on psilocybin therapy, what you should know. We'll cover every single RCT for psychedelics for SUDs. There's not that many of them, then transition to ongoing studies. So first off, what is a psychedelic? How is psychedelic therapy done? So you've gotten quite a nice description already from our patient, but I'm using a pharmacologic definition. So these are drugs including psilocybin, LSD, mescaline. They act on serotonin 2A receptors and produce a wide variety of cognitive, affective, perceptual changes of the kind that you've just heard. And this does not include cannabis or ketamine or ibogaine or salvia or all these other things that are sometimes called psychedelics. And again, just as you've heard, these trials uniformly are done with quite a lot of psychological support before, during, and after. The results of these trials do not necessarily suggest what might happen if you just give the drug alone. And there's reasons that there's so much psychological support, certainly for safety. These can be pretty terrifying experiences, very difficult, but also we think efficacy as well. And even though it's being studied for a variety of conditions, it's currently in phase 3 trials for major depressive disorder, which I'm actually not going to talk about. The method of treatment is pretty similar across very diverse conditions. Lots of psychological support, big dose, and then help the person understand what happened following, and that actually ends up looking a lot like psychotherapy. So I'm not going to get too much into the details of the nuts and bolts of the acute effects. You've heard quite a lot of them, but the acute effects are interesting, but I'm more interested in the fact that there seem to be enduring effects. And I show this slide every opportunity I get. It's one of the most remarkable psychological findings I think I've ever seen. But this is in a trial of healthy participants, psilocybin versus methylphenidate. The quick version is that the majority of people who got psilocybin, and again, in this psychologically supported laboratory environment, majority of people found it to be one of the most meaningful experiences of their life. And again, that's interesting because that also comports with therapeutic benefits. There seems to be something about the subjective experience, and that can be measured in a variety of different ways, but something about the subjective experience seems to predict therapeutic benefits down the road. So just very, very, very quick overview. Now let's get into completed RCTs of psychedelics for substance use disorders. So opioid use disorder, this is near and dear to my heart, and there has only been one study of the psychedelic for opioid use disorder, and this was from our very own Lee McCabe in the 70s. And it's a unique study that could not happen today. So they had 74 people. These were patients that were paroled in an outpatient treatment program, and they were paroled under the condition that they participate in an LSD trial, which of course would not be considered ethical today. And this program had daily UTOX, urine drug monitoring, weekly group treatment. Violation of the program rules could lead to reincarceration, so you have like very, very good follow-up. And basically it's treatment as usual versus treatment as usual plus LSD. And the LSD was given in a pretty similar way as I've described. Lots and lots of psychological support before, support during, and then they had about a week of psychotherapy before sending them into the program. And I'll just quickly note, there's a lot of debate about there's so much hype and excitement, and that's ramping up the placebo effects. These were largely people who were terrified of LSD, did not view these favorably, possibly were coerced into doing this, and nonetheless, the results that you see are about 30% abstinence in the treatment group at a year versus less than 5 after a single dose of LSD. And that's it. There's no other studies for opioid use disorder. For alcohol use disorder, there were about 6 RCTs. I'm not going to really get into the details of this. They were so heterogeneous as to be difficult to sum up and don't necessarily pertain to the modern day, but the gist is that there was a signal in this meta-analysis for doubled odds of abstinence. But we have an RCT done by our colleagues at NYU. And again, all of these are basically doing the same, psychological support dose. In this case, it's 2 doses, psychological support after. So this was about 95 patients, and people were randomized to get 2 doses of psilocybin, 25 to 40 milligrams. They would increase the dose versus diphenhydramine. And this did have, it was motivational enhancement therapy. It was an adjunctive psychological therapy given. Primary outcome, % heavy drinking days over the 32-week follow-up period. This is the baseline. I'll just let you soak this in for a moment. I mean, these are not the most severe alcohol use disorder patients, so 75% drinking days on average. And here's the results. This is the primary outcome on the right. So over that period, about 20% heavy drinking days versus something like 5 drinks per day. You can also see that this decreased abstinence rates. I'm not showing here, but it was 25% in the placebo group versus 50% in the psilocybin group. So signal for efficacy, it was safe. Perhaps not the most impressive results, but there is a signal there. And one thing that's worth mentioning, I mean, kind of with our patient, you might say, well, Sandeep, are these really blinded? Can't people tell? They assessed it, and it wasn't blinded. 95% of people were aware, did correctly guess what they got. So let me pivot to tobacco use disorder. This is, I think, one of the more interesting trials. So we're not looking at anything psychedelic right now. This is just what is known about existing FDA-approved treatments for tobacco use disorder. Y-axis, you have % abstinent. X-axis, you have time and follow-up time points. And basically what you see is that variety of different treatments, and these are effective treatments. None of these really break 40% abstinence in long-term follow-up. Cigarettes kill half of its regular users. Most people try to quit and can't, so there's dire need for better treatments. And so this is an open-label trial. It's not blinded. It's comparing a single dose of psilocybin to the next best thing. Nicotine plus CBT for smoking cessation. So this trial is, they've now accrued the final participants, so it's not published yet, but it's now complete. So everyone gets 4 weeks of CBT for smoking cessation. People are randomized, and again, this is open label, so you know what you're getting. And there is a eventual crossover, I think about a year later, for people who get placebo, nicotine. But week 5 is the target quit date. And one group gets psilocybin with the same procedures we've described. The other group gets standard nicotine patch, which is tapered off. Both groups continue to get quite a lot of psychological support. Intervention done, 3, 6, 12-month follow-up. And people were smoking about a pack a day for 30 years with 7 prior quit attempts on average. So this is what I've already shown you. Bupropion trials on the left, nicotine patch trials on the right, both versus placebo. And these are the results from the Hopkins trial, which the first thing I'll actually, I don't know, you can see the first thing I'll direct you to is the nicotine patch group does about as well as you would expect it to. And if you look at the time points, it's actually slightly better. So this gives us some confidence of assay sensitivity that we are comparing this to something that is real. But then psilocybin, of course, after 1 dose, seems to be doing quite a lot better, and this is a long-term follow-up. So even though this is a non-blinded study, I think it's actually quite reasonable to infer that there's a real treatment effect here. And very briefly, I'll touch on what could be going on here. How can we understand that single doses or 2 doses of a drug could have such therapeutic effects days, weeks, perhaps months, or even years later? One possibility, and this is something that I subscribe to, that there's obviously more research that needs to be done, is that this is acting psychotherapeutically. So I find Jerome Frank's common factors model to be a very, very helpful way of understanding these experiences, which are frankly different for everyone. And he defined these 4 criteria as something that make something a psychotherapy. So an emotionally charged, confiding relationship with an expert, check. Healing setting, check. Rationale, conceptual scheme, or myth that can explain the patient's prior suffering, but also provide a means for alleviating it, check. And then a therapeutic ritual that's kind of participated in by both patient and therapist and is believed by both to be effective. And also, all bona fide psychotherapy should provide ways of practicing and learning and practicing emotional skills. I mean, all of these things are really present in psilocybin therapy as it's practiced. And again, I can't really get too much into this, but there's a lot of reason to think that psilocybin therapy may be amplifying normal psychotherapeutic processes, even though the experience that you heard about is pretty extreme and dramatic and different from the norm. I find that clinicians, and particularly psychiatrists who engage in this kind of therapy in a research environment, find it to be actually quite familiar. At the end of the day, the drug wears off, and then you're left with the patient who has to figure out what to do, and it ends up engaging what looks like normal psychotherapeutic processes. And this is what some of the research has shown about psychotherapy process, how psilocybin may be enhancing psychological insight and mindfulness and the therapeutic alliance. But also, there's some suggestive evidence from animal work that psychedelics generally may enhance plasticity. So if you have this profound psychotherapeutic experience during a state where the brain is more plastic, that could, speculating, but that could explain why you might see some of these effects stick. But again, ultimately, we're still largely working with empirical, just trying to see if these different treatments work for different conditions, and we don't have a very good understanding of why they're working, which, I mean, frankly, is true for a lot of psychiatry. Okay, ongoing RCT. So this is my plea to you all. We have 3 RCTs of psilocybin for substance use disorders. These are all happening at Hopkins, and if I were to include all of the studies for a psychedelic of any kind for any substance use disorder on this list, most of them would still be here. So we are doing, frankly, most of the psychedelics for substance use disorder research in the world. And these are all actively recruiting. So if you go to hopkinspsychedelic.org, click on the research tab, and you'll see contact info for each of these studies, and then there's an e-screener that you can refer patients to that they can just fill out their information and they'll get a call. But you can also email the PIs for the ones that I'll talk about, and I'll go through these one by one. So the first off is the depression, alcohol use disorder comorbidity study. This is the one that you've just heard about. I don't remember how many participants they run. I think it's about 15 to 20, but they're accruing up to 90, and this is a single dose of psilocybin, 25 milligrams, and you've heard the effect of that. That is a high dose versus placebo with a 3-month open label psilocybin, 25 milligrams. And these other trials I've talked about, I mean, some of them are 1 dose, some of them are 2 doses. There's not actually good evidence one way or another. Should we do 2 doses? Is 2 better than 1? This trial kind of indirectly will allow us to compare the effective 2 doses versus 1. And people get standard psychological support. It's exactly the kind that you've heard described, and this is pretty standard throughout all these different trials. And it's mostly for the purpose of building rapport, helping the person understand what sorts of effects could happen, but also encouraging a sort of discouraging experiential avoidance and encouraging experiential acceptance, which seems to be very helpful for navigating these experiences in ways that can be therapeutically beneficial. And this particular trial does have a motivational interviewing intervention, though that's not the case for all of these trials. And again, if you have patients, please consider referring them. We love clinician referrals. But the inclusion criteria you can see here, it's moderate depression and at least 4 non-drinking days per month. Every other trial, except this one, does not allow concurrent antidepressant treatment. Concurrent antidepressant treatment can weaken psilocybin effects, and this trial is unique in that it does allow and exclusions you can see here: suicide attempt, or bipolar or psychotic disorder. But please, if you have patients to refer, you can reach out to Dr. Barrett or go on the website and find more contact information. And this one is my study, and we've gotten approval to start recruiting on Friday. And this is 2 parallel trials. So it's called BiPod, buprenorphine induction with psilocybin for opioid use disorder. And currently we have approval for BiPod which has an inpatient buprenorphine induction, and hopefully within a month we'll get approval for the parallel version, which involves an outpatient buprenorphine induction. But basically, I'll talk about the design of the inpatient study, but these are effectively the same study, just have different inpatient versus outpatient buprenorphine induction. And the basic design is pretty simple. To give people buprenorphine and then give them psilocybin or placebo and follow them up, and the outcome is abstinence and treatment retention. I'll say a little bit more about the design, but one feature about this that I find to be pretty useful for these sorts of early stage clinical trials is I'm using a Bayesian adaptive design. So this involves a sort of an open-ended sample size that is, there are serial checks every 10 participants after 20. And that means that though we anticipate a sample size of 50, it could be as little as 20, as much as 90. It's a sequential trial, and this is a very nice way of maximizing resources if you really don't know what the effect is going to be, so it's quite hard to power a study if you have nothing to really to go on. But the basic intervention will do a 1-week inpatient buprenorphine induction plus standard pre-psilocybin prep. People will get a single high dose of psilocybin, 30 milligrams, or very low dose, 1 milligram, which is effectively a placebo. They will be discharged with outpatient buprenorphine and then followed up weekly for 2 months, which will include meetings with study therapists, weekly urine toxicology, and further buprenorphine prescription. And following that, they're referred out to the community for further treatment and followed up in long-term follow-up for up to 6 months. And anyone who's got active opioid use disorder who is desirous of sustained recovery, willing to take buprenorphine, please consider referring them. We've gotten regulatory approval Friday, and we have not recruited anyone yet. And this is a follow-up study of the previous one that I showed. The previous one was a open label, sort of like a comparative effectiveness study, psilocybin open label versus nicotine open label. This is a double-blind randomized trial led by Matt Johnson and Albert Garcia Romeu. So Hopkins is a site, they are now recruiting. And there's also sites at New York University and University of Alabama, Birmingham that are not started yet, but this involves 2 high-dose psilocybin sessions versus niacin placebo. It has adjunctive CBT for smoking cessation. And again, actively recruiting, and this is all brand new, so please, they haven't recruited anyone yet, so please consider referring your patients. Anyway, thank you. Those were my remarks, and I guess I've ended early, so I can take a bit of time to just show some qualitative responses that it's really nice to start a talk like this with a patient kind of telling you his experiences. This is some of what patients say after the tobacco trial. There's a variety of themes, including altered sense of self, interconnectedness. I'll just give you a little taste of what some other patients say that go through these trials. And these are people that were able to quit smoking. Felt like I died as a smoker and was resurrected as a non-smoker. I jumped up and I said, I'm not a smoker anymore. Smoking just seemed like this minuscule flick, like it was nothing compared to everything that I was feeling and thinking. Basically, the theme here is that smoking just felt very pointless in comparison to whatever this participant had experienced. Themes of interconnectedness are quite common, and this is across conditions, across substance use disorders. And I think a lot of the attention when these studies get reported in the media as about the classic mystical experience, but when you actually look at what participants are saying, these relate quite clearly to the disorder that they have. So feeling of connectedness, feeling of acceptance, which was helpful for this participant quitting smoking. And then finally, rapport with the study team. Again, these are effectively drug-assisted psychotherapy interventions. Okay, well, I'm happy to stop there and answer any questions that people might have.
Very interesting, Dr. Nayak. I didn't realize that most of the studies of psychedelics and substance use are being done at Hopkins. So that's impressive. That's cool. And I also didn't realize there's only ever been one study of psychedelics and opioid use disorder, and it was Lee McCabe.
Yeah, it's very interesting.
He was just at my house last night and talking about his experience in the field, so that's kind of interesting. This whole notion that psychotherapy is central to the process intuitively makes an enormous amount of sense to me. I guess we all know that we can't entirely rely on our intuitions, that we'd love to have data. And I guess I've wondered about the whole issue of at what point people are going to systematically test the hypothesis that the psychotherapeutic piece is crucial. In theory, it seems like you ought to be able to do a clinical trial where you test psilocybin without any psychotherapeutic element versus with. Now, on the other hand, it seems ethically like it might be somewhat problematic if you and everybody is convinced that the psychotherapy is a crucial part. Maybe it's a bad idea not to include it, but it seems like it ought to be tested. Are people thinking about doing that?
It's a fantastic question. I'll break this up into two parts. So first off, yeah, if you want to test this, the way to do it is to give the drug without any of this psychological support before, during, after. And there is an assumption, right? It's not actually empirically substantiated, but it is an assumption that I also share, that the psychological support is necessary for both safety and efficacy. So there is one, so I think it should be studied. There's a group in WashU, St. Louis, that is going to do depression trial of psilocybin, standard high psychological support versus very, very minimal. You have to have something, as part of informed consent, explain what the effects of the drug are, and do have some kind of monitoring, but it's quite minimal. That's a study that I think should be done. I would not send a family member to it, though. It's tricky, right? Because on the one hand, we don't have any empirical evidence because this has never been formally studied. On the other hand, you are subjecting people to experiences where they regularly may feel like they are dying or going crazy, where just kind of plain common sense clinical intuition suggests that you actually need to have somebody that they trust in the room. The other piece of it, though, there's something that gets confused and conflated when I think we talk about this. There is psychotherapy in the sense of you have people talking to the patient, you have therapists talking to the patient, doing something that looks like psychotherapy. But unlike other treatments, the drug effect itself seems to act psychotherapeutically. Even when people kind of have these experiences out in the wild, so it becomes a little complicated to separate those out. But it should be studied, and it has not been yet, but people are planning.
Just to follow that for a minute, I think I see what you mean. We think of psychotherapy being a trained person talking to the patient and guiding them and exploring themes. But you're saying even entirely independent of that, you think that the medication leads to changes in beliefs and perceptions and attitudes and behaviors, and you're saying that's a psychotherapeutic effect. Is that what you mean?
I would say if you just look at what, not just Jerome Frank, but other proponents of the common factors model of psychotherapy, and look at the definition, which is actually quite empirically well substantiated, of what is a psychotherapy, what criteria does something need to have in order for it to be a psychotherapy. Psychedelic therapy actually fits a lot of those criteria. Even with a minimal psychological support, I think it actually does. I should say another way of studying this is to develop drugs that seem to produce a lot of the effects of psychedelics without the so-called trip. So that's something that somebody is trying to do. So we will have a lot more information about all of this. But you really have to triangulate this question from a lot of different angles, I think. Within the next 10 years, we'll know a lot more, though.
Okay, interesting. Dr. Redgrave.
Sandeep, thanks. That was great. It's great to hear about the work. I have two quick questions. I hope one is whether there are predictors of non-response in the nicotine study, particularly whether you looked at neo. So that's sort of, and then sort of a corollary question is whether you ever enroll somebody in the study and then do not progress them based on their difficulties with, say, rapport building or other difficulties psychotherapeutically prior to dosing.
So first question is predictors of non-response. The neuroticism predicts challenging experiences. Challenging experiences do not predict response or non-response. It's pretty hard to actually predict like therapeutic outcomes prior to the drug. Trait absorption predicts, which you could consider a personality trait, predicts propensity for having these kind of positively valenced so-called mystical experiences, which then predict therapeutic benefit, but that's not the strongest effect. And the short answer is no, we don't have good predictors. Second question, are there people who are not progressed due to inability to form sufficient rapport? Yes. That often is more, people would not be entered into the study at all. The thing is, a lot of these do have this criteria of if there's insufficient rapport built between the therapist and the participant, then perhaps you should not continue. But that's never 100% or 0. It's always a matter of judgment. And I have not actually seen that happen, where somebody's admitted into the study, begins, and then they're just not continued. I've seen it considered, but I've never seen it happen.
Interesting. Other folks, Dr. Nestet.
Kind of a comment and a question. Just to Jimmy's question about the control for therapy. Alex Schatzberg did a study a couple weeks ago for ketamine, where they actually anesthetized patients and then gave them the drug, which might be a way to get around the worry of having someone have a potentially dangerous experience unsupervised. I know there's a trial going on that there's a conflict of interest that's happening in use. But my question is actually more about the mechanics of the research. How does funding work in the center? Like for the Butte study, is this an NIH funded thing? Is it from philanthropy? How do you figure out what studies to fund and how does that work?
Yeah, we're in a very odd position right now because for the longest time, this has not been something that you can get any governmental funding for, which is the lifeblood of academic medical research. And so this is the opioid study is a philanthropically funded one. The tobacco study is a NIDA-funded one, and that's, I think, the first clinical psychedelic trial in like 50 years. And mostly philanthropy, a bit of governmental funding, really no pharmaceutical companies at all, other than one study we did. And philanthropy's, it's philanthropy, basically, and hopefully governmental funding is coming online, but it's been pretty slow.
Maybe I'll just add that I think David Yaden in the center just got an NIH grant to study chronic pain.
Chronic lower back pain, and
Right.
we have a couple of other irons in the fire, but it's still a minority to date.
Other folks? Who's that? Dr. Morrow.
Thanks, Sandy. That was a terrific information. There's a lot of enthusiasm in the field, and I think impatience are kind of the results of how all these things are going on. So there's this chatter, and I think practitioners that are already using like ketamine and doctors and advertising this psychedelic and doing patchwork psychotherapy assisted therapy. I'm just curious, as a center and as
So, I mean, ultimately what we were talking about...
Do you want to repeat the question?
I didn't fully understand the question, but I think it was about lots of excitement that intersects with ketamine. How do we kind of keep things from going off the rip? I don't know if that's... Okay. I mean, what we were talking about with psychedelics for anything, any kind of... We're talking about an unapproved experimental treatment that has not met the highest bar of evidence to be out there in the world and being used for all of these different therapeutic things. Ketamine is an approved drug, and I mean, as I've defined it, is not a psychedelic. And as it was sort of initially used for depression, was not used in this psychedelic therapy, it's treated as a drug intervention. So none of this stuff is based on evidence, and there's of course a cash grab out there, and I don't know. I mean, I don't work with ketamine. I am a little skeptical of the wild claims that are made about it and sort of framing it as it sort of traffics in medical research on psilocybin that again is not actually an approved treatment and sort of tries to conflate them. And I think we need to be cautious, basically.
Thanks. Dr. Sedlak.
Do you see this evolving in the trajectory of cannabis? First, it was approved for medical use and then for recreational use. And there are some states that approved the psychedelics for treatment purposes. Do the psychedelic centers have a position formed yet on how they'd like to see this shaped over time?
I would not like it to develop. I mean, cannabis is lots of things, demonized practices of one form or another get legitimacy through medicalization. And I think that's a lot of what happened with medical marijuana. It was sort of a backdoor for recreational marijuana. If people want to legalize recreational marijuana, they should do that. I'm a little worried that psilocybin is not going to follow the same trajectory because there have been statewide initiatives that are legalizing pseudo-medical use, but it's like an unmonitored environment. I'm not in favor of those because, again, it is sort of trafficking in promising medical potential that on its own terms is not ready for prime time. But we're in a federal system and different states are going to do different things, and ultimately we'll see what happens. But so far it does not seem to be following the marijuana trajectory.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Rubel.
Thinking about what we said earlier about psychotherapy, I think there's a lot of pressure on us as psychiatrists to just give medications and not do psychotherapy with wise, insurance wise, etc. Do you think there's a way to leverage our study of psychedelics into infusing our practice with psychotherapy and making it vital?
That is a good question that I don't know how to answer. Yeah, I mean, I will say just sort of psychiatrists are very well positioned for understanding. I mean, these are sort of extreme mental states, but also seem to be psychotherapeutic. And at the very least, I think this should be part of the training. I mean, MDMA, we haven't talked about it all, is much farther ahead in the regulatory process and may be approved under a rather similar model as soon as next year. So, I mean, I think there should be training, but I don't know if I can answer the bigger question you're asking.
Dr. Stoller.
When they find something that they like or that makes them feel better, they tend to continue to use it. And we sort of rely on that for more weakness medications like methadone. For a treatment like this where there's only one dose, is there any data on how many people might continue or experiment and with this sort of related drugs sort of unsanctioned after that one?
The question is unsanctioned use of psychedelics following one or two doses in a therapeutic trial. First off, I should say, I mean, these are not substances which are classically, I mean, you don't see mounting repetitive use in the face of mounting legal, financial, social consequences. They don't produce like classic addiction. and as you might understand it. And these are also these are often not very pleasant experiences. These are not ones that people typically want to repeat over and over again. All of our studies do ask, have you used psilocybin or other psychedelics as well? I actually don't know the answer off the top of my head. There are some patients, of course, who do. By and large, though, it's not a large chunk of people who are repeating this experience during the follow-up period. I don't know if that was a satisfying answer or not, but...
Go ahead, Dr. Bray.
So one of the common threads that I've heard a lot of volunteers experience is one massive perspective change. I wonder, is there any data, are there any data on people making large life decisions following these kinds of treatments? Like, is there any counseling that this should be something that is disruptive in people's lives, even if it is unbound positive?
So this is sort of one of the interesting features of researching for clinical purposes a drug that is being used by millions of people in other ways. So there's any number of anecdotal stories about people taking a psychedelic and then quitting their job and divorcing their whatever and doing this and doing that, like just completely overhauling their life. And so that certainly happens. Within the context of clinical trials, this is, I think, one of the reasons why it's very, very important to wrap it in psychological support before and after. I mean, we tell people not to make any enormous life changes in the weeks and months afterwards. I mean, if it's a good idea immediately after you take a high dose of a psychedelic, it probably, if it's genuinely good, it'll still be good a month or 2 or 3 later. I don't know of any examples off the top of my head of people making very big changes like quitting their job or divorcing somebody or any of that, but it certainly is a risk without appropriate support, I think.
That's a very interesting question, an interesting point. I hadn't heard that before, that is part of the guidance that comes.
Don't make any big decisions.
Interesting. Yeah, go ahead. Is that Dr. Blair behind the mask? I can't tell. Yes. Okay.
I wanted to ask if there's been any chatter or looking into treatment of stimulant use disorders like methamphetamine and cocaine, because I feel like we don't really have any medication-assisted therapies for those.
Yes. Peter Hendricks at University of Alabama, Birmingham I think he has just finished a study of 40 patients with cocaine use disorder, crack largely, and there is chatter about some methamphetamine use disorder study on the West Coast. I don't think they've actually started. I think it might be a pilot study. So there's some talk about it. This is something I would like to study as well.
No preliminary view of how that UAB study went.
I mean, what I've heard is that the results are good, but I don't know anything else.
Okay, interesting.
And it's also a very different population.
Right. Well, with that, we will wrap up, and thanks, Dr. Nayak, for a very interesting round.
Thank you.